What the Enneagram teaches us about anger, fear, and shame. I call types 8, 9, and 1 red personality poles, 2, 3, and 4 green personality poles, and 5, 6, and 7 blue personality poles. And I use the pearl metaphor for InnerLifeSkills teaching on purpose to remind us that sitting beneath the personality is a grain of sand. Just like an oyster gets irritated by an irritant and then coats that irritant in layers of mother of pearl until a beautiful pearl is formed. The personality is formed around a core irritant. Understanding the Enneagram at a deep level means being willing to understand that grain of sand. The Enneagram is formed on the reason for that behavior, the why we do what we do, which we cannot easily see at the surface. So when we look at the red poles, the green poles, and the blue poles, which are classically called triads in the Enneagram world, and they're classically labeled sometimes as gut types, which are red poles, heart types, green pearls, and head types or mind types, blue pearls. They are also associated with one central emotion, that is fear for blue pearls, shame for green pearls, and anger for red pearls. Now, we use the language of this person is a 3, this person is a 7 on the Enneagram, but that's not true. And I'm actually trying to wean myself off that habit. You are never your Enneagram type. Your Enneagram personality pattern is in you. You are not in it. It is a sacred song singing in you. It is a design. Like everything in nature has a pattern. An apple tree's leaves are recognizable. It has a pattern. These patterns of the expression of life are recognizable. And it's also never a judgment to say that pattern is an apple tree, you know? And especially if we know that your personality is in you, you are not in it. And this is where, more alliteration, just brace yourself, the personality prison can become a path of growth. Getting right? But yeah. So what do the red pearls, blue pearls, and green pearls teach us about anger and about fear and shame? If you trace anger, which is in the grain of sand of 8, 9, and 1, and expresses differently. So anger is expressed with differently in an 8, a 9, and a 1, and each type copes with it differently and has a different strategy for coping with anger. But anger is still a part of that grain of sand. Now, all types experience anger. All personalities experience anger. A red pearl, the anger is often, not always, often the last thing to resolve or heal. When a red pearl experiences fear or shame and those settle, it's the grain of sand. So it's the last thing that is left there. And when a red pearl experiences fear or shame, it still seems to have the texture of anger sitting underneath. And vice versa for the other types or the other pearls, yes? So when a green pearl experiences anger or fear, the texture is of shame. And shame is usually the last thing to heal. And when a blue pearl is experiencing fear, fear is often the last thing to heal. And when they feel anger or shame, it has the texture of fear underneath. Subtle, but you can almost taste it, feel it, sense it intuitively, sometimes see it. If we trace the red pearl's anger back to its root, and we trace the green pearl's shame back to its root, and we trace the blue pearl's fear back to its root, if you look deep enough, you find wholeness. Wholeness is the origin point. Wholeness is prior to the grain of sand. Wholeness is what I call true being and true seeing. Wholeness, wisdom, true seeing, true being. It is that is prior to the personality. Using another metaphor, and all metaphors are limited, of course, but it's like the ocean rises in patterns of waves. Carl Gustav Jung, who was very well known for putting forward the terminology of archetype, and the archetypal idea is that the collective unconscious only rose in certain patterns, and there were only so many archetypal stories that the human collective unconscious could express. And that's almost like saying, even though every wave in the ocean is unique, there are patterns of waves, and we could study those patterns to understand them. So what we're doing now is we're asking ourselves, when you look at anger in the red pill, and you look deeper than the wave of its expression, what do you eventually find? And you'll find wholeness, fear arising from wholeness. Now, and shame. Now, that sounds crazy because traditionally anger, fear, and shame feel extremely debilitating, and their expression can be extremely damaging, at the very least limiting and painful. So how on earth could we say that they arise from wholeness? Like a pendulum that swings. The extreme edges of an expression are usually where that very damaging, limiting, and suffering-inducing expression arises. The fulcrum of the pendulum that never moves has the potential of both within it, but there is a natural expression in wholeness that is more stable. And what we're doing now is I'm inviting you to look deeper than anger to find what does it look like in that fulcrum natural expression. If you put it on a pendulum, anger can become something like rage, and it can become extremely damaging in its high volume expression. But if you take anger, not to flip it to its opposite, if you take anger and you just bring it down a notch and you make it closer to the stable pendulum balance line, it still has an expression, but what does it become? Anger becomes fire, confidence, speaking for. It becomes alive, dynamic. I'm sure you can think of more words. I'd love to hear what shows up for you, right? It's still anger, but it's now in a healthy, beautiful expression. That is what it is in wholeness. The journey of an 8, 9, and 1, their growth path is to work with anger and to bring it back to its origin in the ocean so that it still belongs. Because you see, trying to get rid of, replace, push against just sets up another pendulum, doesn't it? And it actually can empower and make anger more toxic. It's like between me and something I'm trying to get rid of is an elastic band. The more I push it away from me, the more power I give it, and the more when it snaps, it's going to become destructive. But if I bring it really, really close and I look and I trace it back, I find, oh, high expressing 8, 9, 1. And remember, low expression, high expression of a type looks very different. A struggling, shriveled little apple tree looks very different to a healthy, thriving apple tree, because we need to know what to give it to grow. And our personalities are the same. We need to coach, guide, lead, facilitate. We need to give our personalities exactly what they need. And what anger needs is it needs to find its home and find what it's trying to speak for that is actually a valid thing. And that is fire, aliveness, being a voice for, assertion, confidence. And when 8, 9, and 1 trace anger back there and honor that, give it a real space. And 9s and 1s tend to struggle with that the most. 8s need to find, that fire is not always only strength in its extreme. 9s need to make peace with anger as a whole by learning to be disruptive, which is part of their growth path. And 1s need to make peace with the judgment of anger as bad, to see anger can be in this form something vital. So let's take blue pearl now. Fear in its extreme form, terror. It's paralyzing, it's debilitating, it's paranoid, it's the mind running stories and fantasies and what ifs. And remember what fear stands for: FEAR, false evidence appearing real. It's the thoughts breeding thoughts, creating a movie nightmare. But if we trace that back and we soften that pendulum and we bring it closer to the fulcrum, what has fear become in its wholeness that belongs and is necessary? Now, I just want to distinguish something for a moment. The body, our biology, has its own kind of adrenaline fear response. It's part of life, right? It's a survival mechanism. My heart's meant to beat faster if I see a tiger running at me. And it's a way to kick in our sympathetic nervous system so that we can have a fight or flight response to keep us alive. I do want to park that in a little box and put it on the side, that we're not really talking about that per se. I'm talking about more the personality induced fear instead of the physiologically, biologically induced fear. And what does that mean? It means that our blue pearl mind is dividing, chopping things up as the mind does. So let's take fear and water it down, turn the volume down, bring it to something honorable, something that belongs, not its opposite. And what does that become? So here are words that come up for me. It's caution. It's a pause. And here's my favorite word for fear in its wholeness form. It's discernment. It's that pause of the mind to discern. It belongs more to the intellect than the mind that just recycles thoughts. Questioning is another nice one. A healthy form of doubt, or a high expression of doubt, is just to be able to question, to not take false evidence that appears real to be true and to question it. Now, 5, 6, and 7 each deal with that differently. So our 5, questioning, discerning, is quite natural. But when that questioning, when that pendulum goes too far for a 5, the 5 doesn't use the discernment to spark action. It becomes more of a paralyzing fear instead of a discernment to move. Which path do I take? Discern, think, move. The moment it moves out of discernment for our 5, a 5 gets paralyzed, can't move. Our 6, if they're not in discernment, they lose autonomy of their own natural expression. And there's a lot of movement of the mind. Do I agree? Don't I agree? And it's instead of a kind of paralysis, it's more like a procrastination and a shifting sands instead of the confidence in self. That's not an exaggerated confidence in the counterphobic expression of 6, because you get a phobic expression and a counterphobic. Counterphobic has become tired, battle weary of fear, and has moved into fight instead of flight. Both can benefit from settling into this fulcrum wholeness of fear. Can you feel how you've got to slow down for this discernment? Whereas out on the edges where 6 mind can live is this manic flipping from one pendulum side to the other. Do I agree? Don't I agree? And then the counterphobic is an aggressive movement. a counter towards fear, right? But if we stay with discernment and the slowed down, more still seeing, it becomes something beautiful. And in our seven is in the extremes, trying to be a moving target, running from fear, running from being trapped, okay, and running from fear as well. And in the extreme, that fear becomes manic for our seven, the chasing of freedom, which becomes its own trap. Whereas the settling into discernment actually helps the seven open the door to five, which is their growth path, which is that witnessing, more cool, dispassionate perception. And finally, our green pearls. It took me a long time to really try and get a sense of what this wholeness was for shame. Let's see what your thoughts are. So extreme shame, of course, heart-wrenching, crippling, almost to the point of self-loathing. It's a sadness of feeling lack, of feeling a lack of worth, of feeling like something about me is unlovable, there's this missing feeling. And then shame in its extreme, very damaging. There can be tinges of guilt running in here as well. And then shame, as we bring it closer, what is that? What is shame in a way that is actually a part of our wholeness and can contribute, that belongs to who we are? And I like a couple of words for this. I like the word accountability. I like the word ownership. I like this idea of self-correcting. If we've actually done something wrong, if we've harmed, we've lied, or we've exaggerated, or we've stepped out of alignment with being honest to ourselves or others, there can be shame, there can be guilt. The guilt in its fulcrum wholeness is it's a self-correcting moment. It's I have stepped out of, I love the word dharma in Sanskrit. It means many things, but it means the rules of life law. It's moral law, ethical law. And when we step out of dharma, when we break dharma, we feel it. Our conscience tells us. So I like the word conscience here. It's that heart conscience, that self-correcting moment that guilt can even tell us to own. Ownership means I stole that. I lied about that. And the owning and the self-correcting and the conscience of that is the wholeness. Now, our 2, 3, and 4 all express shame differently, cope with it differently, and they are all working towards this fulcrum, this higher expression, because the edges are so painful, but also because here it becomes something valuable. And our 2, for example, who is very focused on giving and kindness, can actually miss out on the emotional honesty of saying when I am weak, when I need help, when I want something, and that being the real driver. I want this, therefore I'm doing that. That can be tough for our 2s. On the outside, they feel shame about that. On the extreme edges, guilt. But if it becomes ownership, can you see how that changes? And our 2 can now embrace their wholeness. Our 3, of course, chasing like the image of winning to feel worthy, feeling ashamed of being a loser, can, in its unhealthy expression, cut corners and break dharma in that way. But as you bring that pendulum down, the ownership and the honesty become true authenticity for our 3. It's like the non-fake real, which brings in the humility, which stabilizes the 3. The owning and the accountable and the humble servant. It's service and success. And our 4, who's on the outside, the 4 expression derives worth from the extremes and claims an identity from the extremes. And even though there's a lot of intense emotion and a lot of theatrical emotion often for a low expressing 4, who's still on these edges and hasn't collapsed this pendulum in wholeness, that theater of emotion often is actually still a mask for the real shame. And when that real shame is owned, and the real guilt and the real, because our 4 in extreme can feel entitled to not obey the rules of life, not contribute, not chop wood, carry water. They can feel entitled because I am wounded or special as the polarity, instead of owning, following their conscience, which would take them into a more stable place of, and all 3 would then know their real worth without the masking. Anger, fear, and shame all have their origin in wholeness. And we can all learn from all 9 Enneagram types, because some of what I've said, even if your personality type is not a red pill, you may have related to some of what I said there, because that's where we all meet each other. That behind each wave is an ocean of self. We can therefore all learn from our fellow Enneagram personality types and from our own personality types. Even anger, fear, and shame can be brought back home to the whole true being, true seeing self.